Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dear students, today I will discuss with you the role of the cerebellum in coordination, role of cerebellum in coordination of the voluntary movement. First, I will discuss in brief the anatomy or the functional anatomy of the cerebellum. You know, our cerebellum is located at the back of the brainstem and separated from the brainstem by what's called the fourth ventricle. It is attached to the brainstem by three pair of cerebellar peduncles: the superior cerebellar peduncle, inferior cerebellar peduncle, and the middle cerebellar peduncle. The cerebellum consists of two main parts. Number one, cerebellar cortex. This cortex consists of outer gray matter, which is extensively folded by transverse fissures to increase its surface area, plus the cerebellar cortex. We have what's called deep cerebellar nuclei. This deep cerebellar nuclei present in the white matter of the cerebellum, which include vestigial nucleus, interposed nucleus, and the dentate nucleus. Again in brief, the anatomy of the cerebellum. It is present or located at the back of the brainstem, attached to the brainstem via three cerebellar peduncles: superior, middle, inferior, and you will take the details of these peduncles and the tracts which enter through it and pass through it, or the afferent fibers and efferent fibers that pass through the superior, middle, and the inferior cerebellar peduncles in details in anatomy. Number two, the cerebellum itself consists of outer gray matter and deep cerebellar nuclei, including the vestigial nucleus, interposed nucleus, and dentate nucleus. Also, the cerebellum is divided into three lobes: anterior lobe and posterior lobe and folliculonodular lobe. This is by two main fissures. The first one is the primary fissure, which separates the anterior from the posterior cerebellar lobe, and also the posterolateral fissure, which separates the folliculonodular lobe from the posterior lobe. So we have three cerebellar lobes. The first one, the anterior, and second one posterior, and third one, this is the folliculonodular lobe. The anterior and the posterior lobe of the cerebellum are divided into three longitudinal zones. The first middle zone, this is the vermis or the vermal zone, and the second, this is the paravermal zone. This is the paravermal zone or intermediate zone, and the last one, this is the lateral. This is the lateral hemispheric zone. The lateral hemispheric zones. This is the lateral zone. So the anterior and posterior cerebellar lobes consist of the vermis, paravermal zone, and lateral hemispheric zones. Okay, this is the functional anatomy of the cerebellum. What about this? Is again the parts of the cerebellum. Here this is the anterior, and here this is the posterior, and this is the folliculonodular lobe. Okay, this is the posterior fissure, and this is the primary fissure. Okay, and the anterior and the posterior consist of three longitudinal zones: the vermis and the paravermal zone, and finally the lateral hemispheric zones. What about the functional divisions of the cerebellum? According to its function and its connections, we divide the cerebellum into three main parts, or three functional divisions. The first one, this is the folliculonodular lobe, and this is called vestibulocerebellum or archicerebellum. It is connected to the vestibular apparatus or vestibular system, and this is concerned with regulation of our body equilibrium or balance. The second part, this is called spinocerebellum, which include the vermis and the paravermal zone. The vermis and paravermal zone. It is connected with the spinal cord, and this is concerned with regulation of our posture and the regulation of the voluntary movement. But the last one, this is connected to the cerebral cortex. This is called cerebrocerebellum or new cerebellum, and this is connected to the cortex, and this is concerned with control or regulation or coordination of the voluntary movement and what is called the motor planning and the motor what planning. So we divide the cerebellum into vestibulocerebellum or archicerebellum, new cerebellum, okay, or paleocerebellum, spinocerebellum or paleocerebellum, cerebrocerebellum or a new cerebellum. Again, this is the functional divisions. Number one, vestibulocerebellum. This is the folliculonodular lobe. It is functional connected with the vestibular system. Spinocerebellum or paleocerebellum, which include the vermis and the paravermal zone. It receives information from the spinal cord, okay, and the cerebrocerebellum or new cerebellum, which is the lateral hemispheric zones of the cerebellum, and is functionally connected with the cerebral cortex. This is again the functional divisions of the cerebellum. What about the neural connections or the nervous connections of the cerebellum? Each part of the cerebellum, including the vestibulocerebellum, spinocerebellum, and cerebrocerebellum, has what's called a neural connections with the other nerve centers present in our nervous system or in our CNS. These connections include afferent, what's meant by afferent, sensory nerve fibers. This sensory nerve fiber inform the part of the cerebellum with specific informations according to its main function, okay, and also it send efferent impulses or motor fibers, okay, it send a motor fibers, okay, to the other nerve centers to send its motor orders to specific motor centers present in the brain, okay, to coordinate or to regulate the voluntary movement. Okay, what about the afferent and efferent or sensory and motor connections for each part or each division of the cerebellum? This is figure showing the different connections with different part of the cerebellum, including the archicerebellum or folliculonodular lobe, which receive afferent from the vestibular nuclei and send efferent via the vestigial nucleus to the red nucleus to the vestibular nucleus and to the reticular formation, from which reticulospinal and vestibulospinal originates to control the activity of the alpha motor neurons of the axial and the proximal muscles. Okay. Also, it sends the signals to what's called the medial longitudinal bundle or fascicle, which control the activity of the extraocular muscles. This is the afferent and the efferent connections for what? For the archicerebellum. What about the vermis and the paravermal zone or paleocerebellum or spinocerebellum? It receives afferent impulses mainly from the spinal cord, okay, from the peripheral receptors. Also, it receives afferent from the bones, from the cortex or other nerve centers present in the brainstem. And then it sends the efferent impulses via the vestigial nucleus and the impulsiform nucleus to the vestibular nuclei, reticular formation, red nucleus, and so on. Okay. Also, or the last one, which is the new cerebellum or the cerebrocerebellum, it receives information from the bones, okay, and send the efferent impulses via the dentate nucleus to the contralateral thalamus, to control the activity of the motor cortex of the brain. Okay, go to the details of each part. Number one, vestibulocerebellum. The afferent for vestibulocerebellum coming from the vestibular apparatus, okay, coming from the vestibular apparatus to the folliculonodular lobe. Again, this is the vestibular apparatus, then to vestibular nuclei, then to the vestibular, okay, or vestibulocerebellum. This afferent will inform, okay, the cerebellum or vestibulocerebellum with what? With informations or signals about the head position or exposure to acceleration, either linear acceleration or angular acceleration. What about the efferent? The efferent is coming from the cortex of the vestibulocerebellum to the vestigial nucleus, then it leaves the cerebellum via the inferocerebellar peduncles to terminate on number one, reticular formation and the vestibular nuclei, okay, which are the sites of origin of the vestibulocerebellum, vestibulospinal tract, and the reticulospinal tract, which control the activity of the axial and the proximal muscles. Number 2, to the medial longitudinal bundle, and this medial longitudinal bundle regulate the activity of the extraocular muscles and eye movement, like this. This is the third and fourth and fifth cranial nerve. This is the medial longitudinal bundle or fascicle. Okay, so the efferent coming or will be or will send informations or will send motor orders to reticular formation and vestibular nuclei, and also to the medial longitudinal bundle or fascicle. This is the vestibulocerebellum. What about the spinocerebellum or paleocerebellum? It receives afferent from two main parts. Number 1, from the brain and the brainstem centers, including the cerebral cortex, red nucleus, vestibular nuclei, reticular formation, and the inferior olivary nucleus. What is the significance of these informations? This information sends a copy, okay, of the plan of the movement ordered by the higher motor centers to the spinocerebellum. So in this case, the spinocerebellum will receive information about the plan of the movement. Okay, about the plan of what? Of the movement. Number 2, okay, the second source, this is the peripheral receptors. The peripheral receptors from what? Or via what? Via the dorsal spinocerebellar tract. Dorsal spinocerebellar tract. From the muscle spindle or Golgi tendon organ or joint or cutaneous touch receptors and pressure receptors, this dorsal spinocerebellar tract will terminate ipsilaterally in the vermis and the paravermal zone, will terminate in the vermis and paravermal zone on the same side. On what? On the same side. This is the dorsal spinocerebellar tract. This tract will inform the spinocerebellum about the position and the movement of the different parts of the body. It informs our spinocerebellum with information about the sense of position and sense of what? Of movement. The second tract, okay, the second tract, which coming from the peripheral receptors, this is the ventral spinocerebellar tract. This tract will return quickly to the spinocerebellum a copies of the plan of the motor commands or the motor orders. Okay, so the spinocerebellum, in this case, the spinocerebellum will receive a copy of the plan of the movement from two sides. Number 1, the brain and the brainstem centers, and the number 2, from the ventral spinocerebellar tract. And also it receives information about the actual performance, which is the sense of movement during the performance of the movement. It will receive information about the actual motor performance via what's called dorsal spinocerebellar tract. Dorsal spinocerebellar tract. This is the spinocerebellum. This is what? The spinocerebellum or paleocerebellum. This is the afferent. What about the efferent? The efferent coming from either the vermis or paravermal zone. From the vermis, the signals go to the vestigial nucleus, then to the vestibular nuclei and the reticular formation in the brainstem, then finally to the axial muscles. From the intermediate zone or paravermal zone, it will pass to the interposed nucleus, which is composed of two nuclei, globose and polyform nuclei, via the superior cerebellar peduncle, which project to what? It projects to the following sides. Again, from the intermediate zone, here this is the intermediate zone of the cerebellum. It receives afferent, as we see it before, okay, from the brain and the brainstem centers, okay, and also from the peripheral receptors via the spinocerebellar tracts, including the dorsal and the ventral, okay. Then from the intermediate zone to the polyform nucleus or interposed nucleus, polyform nucleus or interposed nucleus, it passes to what? It passes to the contralateral thalamus, and also to the contralateral red nucleus. Again, to the contralateral thalamus and the contralateral red nucleus, and also to the reticular formation. Okay, from these informations, or from this side, the cortex and the red nucleus, from the cortex and the red nucleus, two tracts mainly originate. Number one, the corticospinal tract, and number two, rubrospinal tract. This reticulospinal and rubrospinal control the activity of the distal muscles, which are responsible for the fine scaled movement. The fine scaled movement. This is what the spinocerebellum or paleocerebellum. What about the cerebrocerebellum or new cerebellum? The new cerebellum, this is the last one, receive afferent impulses from the cerebral cortex via the pontine nuclei. This information will, okay, this is the afferent, which is blue in color. This is the afferent via what's called the pontine nuclei. It sends afferent impulses to the new cerebellum or cerebrocerebellum. This will inform the cerebrocerebellum with information about the motor orders or the motor commands from the motor area, okay. And the number two, it sends what's called sensor information about the postural state of the body from the somatic sensory area. Again, the cerebrocerebellum in this case, okay, will receive information about the plan of the movement and about the spatial position or the position of the body in the space, okay. And the cerebrocerebellum use this information for what? Okay, this information used by the cerebrocerebellum to, okay, for planning for the voluntary movement, planning of the timing of the movement, planning of the sequence of the movement, and so on. So it receives information about the motor commands of the from the motor cortex and about the sensor informations. This is the afferent. What about the efferent? The efferent is coming from what's called the cerebellar cortex, then to the dentate nucleus, and from the dentate nucleus it passes to the contralateral thalamus, and this finally to the cortex, and this pathway is called cerebello-dentato-thalamo-cortical pathway. This pathway or cerebral pathway is important or has important role in adjusting the plan. It has an important role in adjusting the plan of what? Of the motor commands before discharging of this motor plan via what's called the corticospinal tract to the lower motor neuron, to the lower motor neuron, to the lower motor neuron. This is what? This is the afferent and efferent connections for the different functional zones of the cerebellum. To understand this again, I will discuss in details these connections again with the function of each functional division of the cerebellum. So what are the function of the cerebellum? What are the function of our cerebellum? We can summarize the function of the cerebellum into 5 main functions. Number one, it has a role in regulation. It has a role in regulation of body equilibrium. It has a role in regulation of the body position. It has a role in coordination of the voluntary movement, and this is important. And it has a role in learning of the motor acts or the motor skills or motor learning. It has an important role in ballistic movement or rapid ballistic movement. What about the role in equilibrium? The part of the cerebellum which is concerned with the regulation of our equilibrium is what? It is the vestibulocerebellum. Okay, vestibulocerebellum or the folliculonodular loop. When your equilibrium is disturbed or you are exposed to acceleration, whatever, linear acceleration or angular acceleration, this will stimulate your vestibular receptors. In this case, your vestibular system will send a sensory signals to the vestibulocerebellum. And this vestibulocerebellum will receive this information to send the appropriate signals or corrective signals to the following sites. It will send these signals to the vestibular nuclei and the reticular formation, and this will, or these sites, okay, or these centers, or this motor center, vestibular nuclei and the reticular formation, will adjust the tone and the contractility of the axial and the proximal limb muscles, which maintain your equilibrium during changing of your head position and during exposure to what? To acceleration. That's number one. The second side or the second motor side, this is the superior colliculus and medial longitudinal fascicle or bundle. You know, this bundle or this fascicle, okay, connect the three cranial nerves, the motor nuclei of the three cranial nerves, which supply the extraocular muscles, including the third, the fourth, and the sixth cranial nerves. This is will coordinate the eye movement with the head movement during exposure to acceleration to maintain what? To maintain a clear vision. And this clear vision is important to keep your equilibrium during changing the head, during head movement. And this is called, as we mentioned before, this is called vestibulo-ocular reflex. This is called what? Vestibulo-ocular reflex. Okay. This is again how the vestibulocerebellum, this is the vestibulocerebellum or archocerebellum works or do its action. To receive information from the vestibular nuclei, then will send a motor orders via the vestigial nucleus to the vestibular nuclei, okay, which send and reticular formation, which send signals to the lower motor neuron or to the alpha motor neurons via the reticulospinal and the vestibulospinal tract. Then it sends signals to what? To the medial longitudinal bundle, which supply the abducent nerve and oculomotor nerve, which control the activity of the extraocular muscles. Okay, this number one. The first function of the cerebellum is the what? Is the regulation. The first function of the cerebellum is regulation of our equilibrium or balance. The second function, this is the regulation of the posture, and this is the function of the spinocerebellum. What part in the spinocerebellum? Specifically the vermis. So the vermis or the central zone, this is the principal region of the cerebellum, which is concerned with regulation of the posture. It receives information from your muscles and your joint proprioceptors, specifically present in the axial region. Axial region means in the trunk. Okay, concerning what? Concerning the position of the body. Concerning the position of the body. Then it will send a signals to the vestibulospinal and reticulospinal tract to regulate the tone and the contraction of the axial and the proximal what? And the proximal limb muscles. Again, the vermis, okay, this is what? This is the it receives information via the proprioceptors or via spinocerebellar tract, okay, via spinocerebellar tract. Then it sends signals to the vestigial nucleus. From the vestigial, it sends signals to the reticular formation and the vestibular tract, from which reticulospinal and the vestibulospinal tract originate to regulate the activity of what? Of the axial and the proximal limb muscles, okay, to maintain your position or your posture or your postural or your posture during what? During resting conditions. Again, this is the function of what? This is the function of the verbs. What about the next function? The next function of the cerebellum, this is the coordination of the voluntary movement. Coordination of the voluntary movement, this is a function of the intermediate zone of the spinocerebellum plus the cerebrocerebellum. What's meant by coordination? To say your movement is coordinated, it means, okay, you have the ability to proceed smoothly and precisely from one movement to the next in a proper succession. Again, your movement will be coordinated when you have the ability to proceed smoothly and precisely from one movement to the next in a proper succession. To do this, okay, to do a coordination of the voluntary movement, this is done by three main mechanisms done by the different parts of the cerebellum. Number one, you have a comparator and error corrector mechanism. This is by the intermediate zone of the spinocerebellum. And also you have a predictive and damping mechanism. And finally you have a planning of the timing and sequence of the movement. So again, we will discuss in short the mechanism or each mechanism and its role in coordination of the voluntary movement. To do a coordinated movement, you must have what's called a sensory feedback control for the movement. What's meant by sensory feedback control? During the performance of the movement, okay, during performance of the movement, this movement during its performance is regulated by a sensory feedback to what? To adjust or to correct any errors present in the performance of this movement. This is a comparator and error corrector mechanism. When the motor cortex send a motor orders to the muscles to start the performance of a voluntary movement, it will send a copy of the plan of the movement to the spinocerebellum or to the intermediate zone via what? Via the corticopontocerebellar pathway and via the ventral spinocerebellar tract. So the intermediate zone in this condition receive a copy of the plan of the movement. Okay, receive a copy of the plan. The first plan coming from the corticopontocerebellar and the second coming from the ventral spinocerebellar. As the movement proceeds, the spinocerebellum will receive information or signals about the actual performance of the movement via what? The dorsal spinocerebellar tract. So it received the two information: the plan of the movement, number two, the performance of the movement. The intermediate zone of the cerebellum or paravermal zone act as a comparator. What's meant by comparator? Compare the plan with what? With the actual performance. Okay, and if it finds any errors or deviations between them, it will send a corrective signals. Here via to the cortex via the contralateral thalamus. Via what? The contralateral thalamus to correct the error, okay, or send the corrective signal to the motor cortex to correct subconsciously, okay, any error present in the movement. This is the comparator and the error corrector mechanism. The second mechanism by which the cerebellum, specifically here the cerebrocerebellum, coordinate the voluntary movement is the predictive and damping mechanism. What's meant by that? The cerebrocerebellum or cerebellum, or specifically the new cerebellum, receive information regarding the velocity and the direction of the intended movement or the ordered movement. Its velocity and its direction. From this information, the cerebellum or the new cerebellum will predict, okay, how far this part of your body will move in a given time. It predicts the time of stopping of the movement, okay, and also determine the precise time to damp the movement, means stop the movement. Not only to predict the proper time or the precise time to damp the movement, but also it make the decision at the time of a stop. It will send a signal to stop or to damp, okay, the ongoing movement exactly at the intended positions. At what? The intended positions. This is the predictive and damping functions. Okay. The next one or the last mechanism by which the cerebellum coordinates the voluntary movement is the planning, the timing, and sequence of the movement. What's meant by planning the sequence of the movement? The new cerebellum use the information provided from the cortex and from the basal ganglia for planning of the sequence of the muscle, the sequence of the contraction of the different muscles involved in the motor act to achieve what? To achieve the goal of the movement. The muscles, the first muscle, for example, the first muscle contracted the deltoid, the second biceps, the third triceps, and so on. The sequence of the muscles, okay, and the sequence of the contraction of the different muscles involved in what? In the motor act. Not only plan the sequence, it plan the timing, okay, because the cerebellum or the new cerebellum provide a perfect timing of the voluntary movement by computing or calculating the appropriate time of the onset and termination. For what? For each muscles during the performance of the sequence of the successive movement during what? During a voluntary motor act. During the action, it calculate or it compute the appropriate time of the start and termination of the movement. Okay, the start and termination of what? Of the movement. Again, for control or coordination of the voluntary movement, we need three mechanisms. The first one is the comparator and the error corrector. The second one is the predictive and damping, and the last one is planning the sequence and timing of movement. Okay, all of this will assure the smooth progression of the whole movement. What about the role of the cerebellum in motor learning? This is a function of the new cerebellum. You know, your cerebellum contains what's called neuronal circuits. These neuronal circuits involved in what's called motor learning or learning of a new motor skills. When the person perform a complex motor act for the first time, okay, the activity or the action of these neuronal circuits, okay, in adjusting the onset and termination of the successive contraction of the muscles involved, will be inaccurate. First, the action of the neural circuits in control of the onset and termination of the muscle contractions or successive muscle contractions involved in the motor act is inaccurate. Okay, with more time or with repetition, the activity of the cerebellar neuronal circuits will be more accurate in the next time. Thus, after the motor act has been repeated many times, this is called motor learning. The successive steps of the motor act become gradually more precise. Once the cerebellum perfectly learned its rule in different pattern of movement, it establishes a specific stored program for each movement. And if you want to do this movement again, okay, you will, okay, the cerebellum will send directly the program of the movement to the cortex to start initiation of the movement. Okay, this is the motor learning or the role of cerebellum in motor learning. The last function of the cerebellum, this is its role in rapid and ballistic movement. This movement, rapid movement or ballistic movement, include writing, typing, running, talking, some athletic professional motor skills, and so on. This movement occurs rapidly so that it is almost impossible to depend on their control on the sensory feedback information, because this movement would be over before the information reach your cerebellum and your cortex. This kind of movement has no what's called sensory feedback control. They are a very rapid movement. Ballistic. What's meant by ballistic? Ballistic means there is no way to modify its course by any sensory feedback control mechanism. Ballistic means, okay, they have no, or there is no way to modify its course by any sensory feedback control mechanism. This is the role of the cerebellum. Again, we can summarize again the function of the cerebellum into 5 main functions. Number 1, its role in regulation of the equilibrium. Number 2, regulation of the body position. Number 3, coordination of the voluntary movement. Number 4, motor learning. Number 5, rapid and ballistic movement. What about the disorders of the cerebellum? We have 3 main disorders, okay? Folliculonodular lobe disorders, vermal disorders, and the new cerebellar disorders. This is, we talk about the new cerebellar syndrome in details, okay? In folliculonodular lobe disorders, you have 2 main signs. Number 1, swaying during standing with the tendency to fall down. That's number 1. Number 2, unsteady or staggering gait. This is a wide-based gait. This wide-based gait provides better equilibrium during walking. Regarding the vermin or the regarding the vermal disorders, This patient having impairment disorders have inability to maintain the upright position or upright standing during due to what? Due to failure of adjusting the tone and the contractility of the anti-gravity muscles. What about the new cerebellum? The new cerebellum, this is due to a vascular or degenerative or tumor causes. It is manifested by three main signs. Number one, weak muscle tone. This is hypotonia. Absence or weakness of the muscle power. This is called asthenia. Asthenia means no muscle power. A means no. Asthenia means power, so no muscle power. Okay, ataxia means coordination of the voluntary movement. So the three characteristic signs of the new cerebellar syndrome: hypotonia, asthenia, and ataxia. What is meant by ataxia or asynergia? Ataxia means incoordination of the voluntary movement. What are the signs and symptoms of ataxia or cerebellar ataxia or asynergia? It is manifested by what's called dysmetria, intention kinetic tremors, decomposition of the movement become like the movement of the report, rebound phenomena, Diado Calcaneus, scanning speech, and finally unsteady gait or staggering gait or drunken gait. We will discuss this in details, but the first three signs, including dysmetria and intention kinetic tremors and decomposition of the voluntary movement, can be observed or can be demonstrated during specific tests, like what? The fingers to fingers test, and fingers to nose test, and so on, and heel to knee test. Okay, what's meant by fingers to nose test? You ask the patient to stretch his forearm, okay, out, okay, then bring his finger, okay, to what? To touch the nose. To touch what? The nose. Okay, the normal way, no problem. Okay, the patient or the normal patient, okay, at the time of nose, okay, stop, okay, or just touch the nose of or his nose, okay. But if your patient having a new cerebellar syndrome, okay, you can see three important findings. Number one, you have what's called dysmetria. What's meant by dysmetria? Okay, the patient stop his movement or limb movement before reaching the nose or after reaching the nose, or he may strike his nose. Okay, this is called dysmetria. The second sign, you can find it during fingers to nose test. Okay, what's called intention kinetic tremors. During performance of the hand movement, okay, he has what's called a hand tremors. This tremors increase as he approach the intended point. That's why we can say this is intention tremors. Intention kinetic tremors means tremors appear during what? Movement. The third one or the last one, the movement of the limb is decomposed. The movement of the limb is decomposed, like the movement of what? Of a report. Okay. This is a test of this Diado Calcaneus, and this is the heel to shin test. Okay, this is the main test we do for a patient with cerebellar ataxia. Okay, you will take this in details in clinical. Okay, what about the dysmetria? In dysmetria, there is an error in the range and direction of the movement. The moving limb, we can see more often overshot the intended point or the target point, and this is called hypermetria or past pointing, or sometimes the limb undershot the intended point. This is called hypometria. What's meant by undershot? Stop before reaching the intended point or the target point. This errors results from failure of the comparator function of the cerebellum and damping function of the cerebellum, which normally adjusts the course of the movement and bring the movement smoothly to the desired position or to the intended point. This is the dysmetria. This is the first sign. The second sign, this is the tremors and decomposition of the movement. The tremors are known as intention tremors or intention kinetic tremors. These tremors appear when the patient performs a voluntary motor act and not or absent during rest. and they become more exaggerated as the limb reach the target point or the intended point. That's why it's called intention kinetic tremors. The second the second point, this is decomposition of the complex movement. The motor act that is carried out as a several fragmented steps rather than smoothly progressing movement. For example, in reaching for an object by the hand, the cerebellar patient may first move the shoulder joint, then the elbow joint, then the wrist, and then the fingers, simulating the movements of what? Of a robot. Simulating the movement of a robot. So his movement become decomposed. Okay, this is the dysmetria, tremors, and finally decomposition of the movement. This signs can be demonstrated during the fingers to nose test. What about rebound phenomena? In rebound phenomena, look for this diagram. This is a rebound phenomenon. Okay, you ask the patient to flex his forearm like this against the resistance. This resistance is made by the examiner's hand, and then suddenly the examiner will relieve or release the resistance. Okay, suddenly release the resistance. Okay, so the forearm of the patient, okay, will or may strike the face of the patient because he has no damping function or stopping functions again. So the rebound phenomena means the patient unable to stop what? The ongoing movement rapidly due to what? To the failure of the predictive and damping function of the cerebellum. So when your patient flex his forearm against the resistance provided by the examiner hand, the cerebellar patient cannot stop the resulting inward movement of the limb due to what? In due time following its release. Okay, so the forearm flexes forcibly and may strike the body, and this is concerned as a violence. So this test nowadays obsolete. Obsolete means it is prohibited to do a test like this because this is may injure your patient, okay, or may hurt your patient. Okay, number 4, this diadochokinesia. What's meant by this diadochokinesia? It is the inability of the patient to perform a rapid alternating opposing movement like repetitive pronation and supination. Ask the patient to do rapid pronation and rapid supination. He has no ability, okay, to do this. The movement will become slow and irregular, and this is due to failure of what? Failure for the proper timing for the onset and termination. Okay, so there is no proper timing. So this is due to failure of the function of the cerebellum, which is called, okay, timing or planning the timing and sequence of the movement. Planning the timing and sequence of the movement. Okay, so this is called dysdiadochokinesis. What about the nystagmus and the gait of the patient? The nystagmus, okay, of cerebellar disorder is a tremor of the eye pool. This is as a result of a dysmetria of what? Of the saccadic movement of the eye. Okay, the saccadic movement of the eye, you have what's called dysmetria. This is the nystagmus or cerebellar nystagmus. What about the gait? The gait of the patient is unsteady or wide base gait due to dysmetria and the kinetic tremors of the lower limb. Like this. Okay, wide base gait. Okay, this is wide base gait. Try to keep the equilibrium or the balance during what? During the walking. Scanning speech. This is the last sign in cerebellar ataxia. The speech becomes slow and decomposed, and each word is fragmented. So the speech becomes like a scan. This is called scanning speech or staccato speech. Okay, we can simulate this kind of speech like a person trying to learn or to speak a new language for the first time. Like a person try to speak a new language for the first time. This is the scanning speech. This is due to decomposition of the words, and this is due to failure of adjustment of the proper timing of the contraction of the muscles of the speech or the speech muscles. This is the signs of what? This is the signs of new cerebellar syndrome. Again, the new cerebellar syndrome or cerebellar ataxia has dysmetria, number one, intention kinetic tremors, decomposition of the movement, rebound phenomena, uh, scanning speech, unsteady gait or staggering gait or drunken gait, okay, nystagmus or cerebellar nystagmus, and finally, okay, it has what's called this Diado Calcaneus. Dear student, I hope everything is clear now for you, and see you in the next lectures inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.